At this point, we have covered some of the main traits and tendencies that can come along with an autistic neurotype. Again, no one single person will have every trait and tendency we covered, and there are many that we did not cover. But the presence of certain traits and tendencies in certain categories is why we are able to identify autism. So then, how is autism identified in a person? In the United States, the CDC, or Centers for Disease Control, is the body which clarifies what does and does not comprise autism. Its DSM-5, Diagnostic Statistical Manual version 5, is the resource that provides the official guidelines for what an autism identification or diagnosis means. Internationally, the World Health Organization uses a different resource, the International Classification of Diseases, with the latest version being the IDC-11. But the criteria of what comprises autism is very similar when you compare the two. By the way, did you catch the commonality between these two organizations and their resources? It's the word disease. So here we are looking at how autism is identified. You might notice that I use the word identified instead of diagnosed. That language shift is part of recent trends to move autism away from a medical model, an outdated approach which places the autistic individual on the outside in reference to a majority, and portrays that individual as deficient in various ways. It's a model that categorizes autism as if it is a disease, a pathology. Instead, as is increasingly being supported, I and many others believe that autism is a natural variation in humanity, one that has existed for as long as humanity, and one which is predominantly driven by genetics. Autistic people have always been around, and in the early days of civilization, they were likely more highly valued. The ability to sense weather changes from subtle environmental clues, or to categorize and memorize varieties and habitats of plants and animals, some of which are helpful and some are harmful. Those are just two examples of how someone with an autistic neurotype would have been beneficial and thus valued by early peoples. Categorizing autism with other diseases is consistent with negative language that these medical definitions of autism rely on. The DSM-5 and IDC-11's definitions of autism are readily available to the public through a Google search, so you can easily access them if you like. If you do, you will see that they rely on words like deficits, difficulties, deficiencies, and failures, and adverse effects, and on descriptors like abnormal, poorly integrated, inappropriate, atypical, and excessive to explain what comprises autism. We're going to look at a less biased way at what America's CDC and the International World Health Organization agree must be true for autism to be identified. In terms of the traits and tendencies which can be affected by autism, which we covered earlier, several clearly will be involved with social communication and interaction, like honest and direct communication, differences in facial expressions and body language, heightened loyalty and sense of justice, desire for autonomy, and autistic empathy. Other traits impact social communication and interaction less obviously, but still in important ways. Recognition of patterns and exceptions, as well as different ways of analyzing situations and solving problems, also impact autistic individuals with respect to social communication and interaction. In terms of recurring patterns within behavior and tendencies, autistic inertia, repetitive behaviors, stimming, and desire for routine all fall within this category, as do pattern and exception recognition, autonomy, loyalty and justice, and special interests. And the extended category of sensory sensitivities we began the course with, and all that it entails, clearly overlaps both of these areas of social communication and interaction and repetitive tendencies and patterns of behavior. Being extra aware of the temperature within a room, or of a person's volume, or of ambient odors can inhibit our ability to connect socially and concentrate on a conversation, for example. And having heightened or reduced awareness to our senses can result in repetitive behaviors or tendencies either way. And there are countless more examples. In order for a person to be designated as autistic, there needs to be considerable evidence in each of these 4 bulleted categories. Sounds pretty complex, maybe, and autism is certainly a complex condition. The great variety of traits and tendencies and the variability within them support that fact. But there's something very, very big that adds ever more complexity to autism, and that is masking or camouflaging. The traits and tendencies that we have covered make people with autism stand out. They mark us as different from the majority. Sometimes autistic traits and tendencies are identifiable from an early age, as early as 2 or 3 years old. Autism can co-occur with intellectual disabilities in toddlers and young children, or with behavioral problems, or other clear indicators which can lead to identification before school begins. But what if the autistic individual does not have an intellectual disability, and instead is above average or highly intelligent? It tends to be either one or the other, with far fewer autistic people leaning toward average intelligence. Once socialization or schooling begins, usually at around age 3, what if the child begins to understand that the ways of the other children aren't the same as their own? Don't forget, autistic minds are highly tuned into details and differences, and they do their best to adapt. What if being seen and treated as different by both adults and peers, just for thinking or acting in the way that comes most naturally, makes a child feel bad and question themselves? What can often happen is the child makes adjustments to act more like the other children, even if it is not the way that is most natural or comfortable for them. Even though our natural instincts don't align with the behaviors of others, some of us learn over time what more typical behavior is, and we do our best to adjust to it. In doing so, we stand out less. It doesn't feel good to be treated poorly or like you are different, so some of us did what we could to seem more like the others. And because we are young children when adaptation begins, we don't even realize that it's happening. Then, what if this adaptation continues through the adolescent years and on through adulthood? Is the person still autistic? Definitely. But will other people realize that they are autistic? Very possibly not. Sometimes, just through a young child or teenager or adult's desire to fit in and to not stand out in an undesirable way, they get pretty good at masking or camouflaging their differences. Some stims might be visible and obvious to others, but can also be invisible or harder to spot. In fact, some autistic people deliberately choose invisible or harder to spot stims so that they don't draw attention to themselves. Because of masking, it will be unclear that a person is truly struggling day to day, and ongoing needs will not be met. The sad irony is that masking impedes identification. If you remember back to the 4 bullet points that need to be present for autism to be identified, the final one was that elements of both of the other categories need to have been present since early development and are lifelong, though masking may make or may have made them less noticeable. We'll cover what happens when masking and trying to cope just become too much in the next section of the course. But for now, the message is, masking is a part of autism for many, many people. It is not an act we put on or any deliberate plan to deceive. It is, instead, a mark of simple survival, and an attempt to lessen the negative reaction and judgment we would otherwise be subject to. Take someone like myself, completely unaware of my autism until my daughter was identified when she was 15 and I was 45 years old. Or David, identified in his 50s. No one noticed our differences because we did our best to minimize them. And we didn't have any reference point or easily accessed educational materials to help us realize that we actually could be fundamentally different than other people. Why would we not think that everyone experienced the world like we do? There are many, many more people all over the world like David, my daughter, and myself. We were by no means alone in these challenges we faced and in how we did our best to figure out on our own how to cope with them. So many people who are autistic simply don't know it, and that means they live especially hard lives. Until the turn of the century, information about autism was difficult, if not impossible, for average citizens to access. And until uncovering autism, the basic facts about autism couldn't be found in one place, related by friendly faces who understand the autistic experience because they have lived it for decades. If autism is missed in childhood, as the statistics clearly support it so often has been, it is unlikely it will be caught later in life through regular interactions with professionals. It almost always requires the individual to become aware, to advocate, and to speak up and act. That leads to people having to figure it out on their own, either for themselves or their children. And yes, because of the high genetic connection in autism, when a child is identified as autistic, there's a good likelihood that at least one parent or grandparent has been on the spectrum all their lives too. Along with masking, co-occurring issues like anxiety and depression can cloud a diagnosis and make it more complex, or sometimes lead to misdiagnoses and possibly underlying autism continuing to be unidentified. Having the right recognition and support as an autistic person is so important because autistic people are at a much higher risk of dying by suicide than the general population. Different studies reporting up to 8 or even 10 times higher.